Good evening, bonsoir. Hello, everyone. My name is Hélène Giroux, and I'm the director of the Wakefield Writers Festival. Thank you very much for being with us today. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being with us this evening. On behalf of the festival, we welcome guests on the unceded territory of the Algonquin people. We recognize their strength and wisdom, their stewardship of the land and water, of the plants and animals. Together, let's strengthen our commitment to learn about and learn with Indigenous people with respectful thanks, advocacy, and action towards reparation and reconciliation. We're delighted to be celebrating our 10th anniversary this evening. Who'd have thought? 10 years ago, in 2013. Our theme is joy, the power of story. Our world is facing some pretty significant global challenges right now, and our guests are going to, through their works and through their experiences and through their thoughts, are going to explore ways how to find joy, to nurture hope, and to live with compassionate conviction. Last evening, Wab Rice and Kai Thomas with Adrienne Harewood shared powerful stories of resilience. Tomorrow, we welcome the extraordinary multidisciplinary Québécois artists and authors, Chloé Sainte-Marie, Marc Séguin, and Julie Huard. On Saturday, Sally Armstrong and R.H. Thompson with Adrienne Harewood will share stories of courage. The festival closes on Sunday with stories of renewal with Suvankam Tamavanka, Jamal Saeed, Lauren Scanlon, and Francis Itani. Last night was an incredibly rich and powerful conversation. Tonight will be the same, and it's a pretty wonderful week. We wouldn't be able to offer the festival without the support of our many sponsors and funders: the Canada Council for the Arts, Canadian Heritage, the English Language Arts Network, la MRC des Collines de l'Outaouais, and since our very beginning, la Municipalité de la Pêche, and also our many local sponsors and supporters that you can see up here. I also want to take a moment to thank everyone who makes the festival possible. We have Al Connors on live stream, we have Greg Brown on sound, John Schmidt, who does our digital marketing, Elise McLean, who does our beautiful graphics, Francisca Hines, who takes all of our photos throughout the festival, Pam Scobie, our volunteer coordinator, and all of our exceptional volunteers, Lucy Sholey, who does our social media, Biblio Wakefield Library, the Centre Wakefield La Pêche, that's Laura Burks and the Riser crew, and our bookseller, Jim Sherman from Perfect Books Ottawa. Jim, thanks very much for being with us again this year. Thank you. To Chris Corcoran and Peter Gillies, you're somewhere this evening. I know I saw you. To say how much of a joy it was to work with you for 9 years as we brought the festival to light. Thank you so much for those years. And to two extraordinary colleagues without whom the festival would not be possible this evening, festival co-organizers Roberta Lloyd and Amy Carver. Thank you very much. It is now my very real and great pleasure to introduce Lucy van Oldenbarneveld, Heather O'Neill, and Jane Urquhart. Please. Welcome. Lucy. Lucy, for the past 20 years, Lucy's main pursuit has been journalism, first as CBC radio host and then as the evening news anchor on CBC TV in Ottawa. Her work was recognized with the Canadian Screen Award win in 2020, numerous Gemini nominations, and the Gold World Medal for Best Talk Interview Program at the New York Festival. She's been recognized many times for her work during 9/11, and during the time there was an active shooter on Parliament Hill, and weeks of live coverage of COVID-19. She helped CBC navigate the controversial decision to suspend local TV coverage during the early days of the pandemic. In her new role with Lucy van Oldenbarneveld Communications, Lucy is now turning her communication skills to helping others deliver clear, concise messages as a media trainer, making sense of the media landscape, and guiding crisis response. Lucy, we're delighted to welcome you back to Writers' Fete. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hélène. Thank you very much for that. Geez, I forgot about those early days of the pandemic when the local news went off the air, but don't get me started on that. Well, thank you all for coming tonight. Another sold-out crowd, so give yourselves a round of applause. We're pretty excited about that. And thank you, Hélène, and your team for creating this wonderful event year after year, 10 years now. And there's obviously such a response. People love it. So this is really thrilling to see so many people come out to talk about writing, to see authors and meet them. And tonight we have two authors at the peak of their game. And tonight I think you're in for a treat, an amusement, a literary excursion, and a great conversation. Then there'll be a chance for you to ask some questions and, of course, to buy the books. How many of you have already read these amazing books? That's quite a few. Okay. Well, maybe I'll revisit the idea of some spoilers then. No, I won't. I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding. So Heather O'Neill's The Capital of Dreams is an anti-war fable, a dark fairy tale, and a page-turning adventure with a disturbing yet optimistic coming of age. In Winter, I Get Up at Night is Jane Urquhart's first novel in 10 years, and it introduces us to Emer, navigating an early tragedy and injury and life in rural Saskatchewan. Resilience and darkness commingle the pages along with charmingly brave children. So you already know our incredible authors, but let me tell you a little bit more about them. Heather O'Neill is known for her lyrical storytelling, imaginative worlds. She has a gift for weaving magic into the everyday, blending whimsy and gritty realism. And that's no different in The Capital of Dreams. She takes us on a journey through a dreamlike yet dark and inspirational country at war. Our guide is 14-year-old Sophia. You may be familiar with her past works, Lullabies for Little Criminals or The Lonely Hearts Hotel. And if you love them, and I know you probably have, that's why you're here, you'll find The Capital of Dreams carries the same emotional depth. Lullabies for Little Criminals won the Canada Reads competition and earned Heather a place among Canada's most celebrated contemporary authors. Go ahead and applaud, right on. And Jane Urquhart, of course, she is back after 10 years. She is here. I know, right? The fans. She's back with In Winter, I Get Up at Night, and this is her first novel in a decade. It's a moving and evocative book that bobs and weaves between stories and time so skillfully. And as Heather and I were remarking backstage, I mean, it is just so Jane. It's just got so many of those emblematic Jane moments in it. It's a novel, it's a masterclass in writing and storytelling, the language, the sense of place, the delicate scenes that are filled with love and pain and fear and compassion. The characters are memorable. And this book packs a social commentary that keeps coming at you, and it plants seeds for us all the way throughout the book, and the harvest comes towards the end, and wow, is it something. Jane, you know her from 8 critically acclaimed novels, nonfiction and poetry that have received the Governor General's Award, have been finalists for the Impact Dublin Literary Award, the Orange Prize, the Booker Long List, and this year's Giller Long List. I mean, these two women, you've come to the right place tonight, you guys. All right, so why don't we start off hearing a short reading from each of our authors tonight. So Heather, would you get us started, please? And you can do it there, you can come here, whatever you like. Come on. Do you have a preference?
Oh. That's fine. I'm just going to read the first little chapter, which is called the Prologue. Prologue. There was the sound of gunshots going off somewhere in the distance, but there was no reaction to them on the young girl's face. She was sitting in the back of a flatbed truck between boxes of cabbage facing the road. She looked no more than 12, but in truth she was 14 years old. Sophia was dressed in a threadbare black coat that looked as though it had seen more winters than the girl had been alive. It surely must have been passed on to her. Her hair was tied up on her head with a flowered red kerchief, a pattern that was popular with the peasants. The truck rumbled quickly down the country road. It seemed to react to every stone it went over. The cabbages leapt out of their boxes and fell back in. The girl looked rather precariously perched, as though one large bump might launch her right off the back of the truck, but she sat up there stoically. She was holding a large goose in her arms. The goose remained still, only moving its neck occasionally to get a better look at where they might be going. The girl held on to the goose as though it were her only possession, as though it were the only object she owned, and there was a good chance it was. People were being displaced all over the country because of the war, and they could be found clutching the most random of objects. Her thin fingers that were gripping the goose were soft and unblemished. How was it that this girl had hands that looked as if they had never worked a single day in their lives? Although she was dressed like a peasant and at first glance would easily be mistaken for one, there was something about her pale face that looked refined. It looked as though it could only belong to an upper-class girl from the capital. She had gray eyes that were common in Alicia and thin, dirty blonde hair that fell in stringy locks from her kerchief. She was not beautiful. In fact, she might have been considered plain, but her expression had a certain conceit and sophistication to it. It was this arrogance the enemy had been so vocal about in their propaganda, the devilish, corrupt pride of the metropolitan elite whom they wanted to destroy at all costs. But the most striking thing about her was that she was all alone. Were it not wartime, surely some adult would have been with her, but people had already begun to look away when they came across children who had been separated from everyone they loved. She was like a stray dog people avoided eye contact with. It was not at all good to look into the eyes of a broken animal. It was too much to bear. She was a million miles from anyone who could help her.
Heather. Jane, would you like to read a bit for us?
So, in this novel, as Lucy said, there are children, and the children are in a children's ward in a hospital. So I decided to read a little section about the arrival of there were two. Emer ends up in the hospital at the age of 11, and she has next to her a boy called Friedrich, and then other children start to arrive with other problems. And this is the third child. Well, in fact, it begins with the boy first, but then goes into the arrival of the third child. That afternoon, when I was fully awake, Friedrich and I examined each other guardedly. We were both in pain because of the change of our positions, and that put tension between us. Pain, you see, always demands privacy, whether it gets it or not. Pain does not want witnesses because it does not wish to be remembered and refuses utterly to take responsibility for the humiliation it causes. We were embarrassed by our individual suffering, and we were concerned that evidence of this suffering might cause us to lose what little power we had in relation to each other, or at least that's what I think, looking back. Added to this, the nuns were attempting to convey some information, not to me exactly, but for certain to Friedrich. She will be here soon, Friedrich, Sister Philomena was saying. Soon you will have another little friend to keep you company. Another little friend. I felt the beginning of envy. Would Friedrich prefer her to me? But that uncomfortable feeling was interrupted when Sister Philomena lifted Friedrich's knees to help him lie down again, because, as she said, the sitting up was tiring and he was losing color and might faint. As she did this, the sheet around his waist was taken away, and I saw his thin white legs. He did not have a right foot. And Sister Philomena was inspecting the end of the footless leg and commenting on how nicely it was mending. I was horrified. The conductor, who, though dressed in his uniform, bore a striking resemblance to Dr. Carpenter, roared like a passing train through my mind's eye and my mind's ear. Then he blew his whistle, but before anyone could get on board, he spun around, danced up the 3 stairs leading to the parlor car, and closed the door with a bang. Shortly after this, a girl we would come to know as Tatiana was wheeled slowly, ceremoniously into our room and taken to a space to the right of the door. She neither moved nor made a sound on her gurney, but I was certain that a veil of sun-shot snow followed in her wake, as surely as if it had been part of a costume. Dr. Carpenter was with her, walking alongside with a slow, steady pace. 2 other men in white, men whom I would later learn to call the orderlies, pushed her bed and steadied the medical apparatus that surmounted it. Behind them, rendered silent by the gravity of the situation, were some of the members of the company, including the daily clown who had intended to cartwheel into the room, but had met up with Titania's conveyance before his hijinks began. They now looked first at the child on the gurney and then at Friedrich. The clown, who today was Bert Simpson from Swift Current, began to cry quietly. His very real tears turned into black tears by the only tear that was painted on his face. 2 nurses who were not nuns and who followed the company into the room were also weeping. "This is Tatiana," Dr. Carpenter told us quietly, or so I remember, so quietly I could barely hear him. "She has been badly burned."
Thank you, Jane. You know, it strikes me, listening to the choice of reading for both of you, that these are both young girls alone. 11-year-old Emer when she's in the hospital, 14-year-old Sophia, who is, you know, navigating her way through a country at war by herself with a goose. The choice to use vulnerable young women. Tell me about that choice and what they have to navigate at that age, and why that particular vulnerability is so worrisome. I mean, it's worrisome to read because you feel the vulnerability. So Heather, maybe we can start with you on that.
Yes. So, I mean, it comes up in a lot of my books, this idea, and there's something about the young girl alone that I was always attracted to in books when I was reading, because I felt so alone in the world, I think, and that's a particular age when you start navigating different difficulties and the world starts seeing you in a different way and starts objectifying you, firstly, and it gets very involved in what your sort of narrative is. And so being able to retain your narrative and who you are at that age is always such a difficult dance. So I love the dance of my characters trying to, whenever they face danger or people who want to sort of take away who they are, how they're able to believe in themselves in a sort of world that doesn't put any value on the young girl, and how they're able to find their own sort of depth and philosophy.
Yeah. Okay. And that. Yeah. I can
really
hear
interesting. Yeah. I feel that most Victorian literature was and is and remains children's literature. I remember reading Victorian literature when I was a child, actually, maybe between the ages of 10 and 14, and identifying so strongly with Jane Eyre being locked in the red room, or, and none of these kids had any agency, really. None of those Victorian children, and Dickens, another perfect example, like the kid is, the man writing the book is remembering himself as a child. And I think that got into me at a very early age, this notion that you opened a book with a child, because what else was there really to explain the sort of lack of power balance in the world? And of course, the Victorian world, children were often abused and often, relegated to, and there were street urchins and et cetera. The other thing I think that happens, because there's always a child, whether or not they're a main character, there is always a child in my book, in my books, and I feel that somehow you have to get in touch with the child inside you to make up these stories in the first place. And I'm sure that's true of Heather. I mean, I've just finished her book and I absolutely adored it, because it pulled me through, it pulled the child out of me. When I was reading this book, I felt as if I were perhaps 14 again, and I think that delight with stories and that delight with narrative is present in ourselves as readers, and also when we start to write books. I mean, you got to get in touch with the child who you used to be in order to do it at all, or even to imagine doing it. When you think about it, it's really quite an act.
Yeah, I was reading Clarice Lispector, she had wrote that when she was young, she had no idea where books came from, and she thought maybe they grew out of the ground like plants. Yes. And then I remember when I was very young wondering where these books came from and thinking maybe they had been written by other children.
Oh, well, there you go. And in some way, they had been. Yeah, for sure. I think that, I mean, I'm not sure that you can ever teach anybody how to write, but you could at least get them to remember something from childhood to get started. I think that is almost a guarantee.
Now, the children we meet in each of your books are doing very different things. One is traveling with a goose through a war-ravaged country. But Emer, who we meet in that hospital room, we also get to know her as an adult, and we see her journey there. What is the connection? So when you say you want to be able to infuse the adult with some of the child's experiences, what effect does that have?
Well, I don't think we ever really fully recover from our childhood in the sense that even if it's a wonderful childhood, we have a sense of loss about it because the wonderful childhood ends. And as Heather says, you get objectified and all of a sudden people start seeing you differently. But, wonderful or terrible, a childhood vanishes, really. And so we have to call on it, I think. Yeah, I think we have to conjure it up.
Huh. So Heather, let's just back up a bit to talk about sort of the overall idea for the book. Where did this come to for you? We meet the goose, we meet Sophia, and she's about to set out on her journey. Where did this come from, this dark fairy tale for you?
So the fairy tale, I had this, actually, I have all these list of books that I want to, when I was I think 17 years old, I wrote a list of books that I want to write, and I'm still on the list, which is strange. The last book before was write a book about the French Revolution. I was like, okay, I'll do it.
There you go.
And so this one was, and I had, that one was a paragraph, and it was a girl, and it had come because so most of us, what we know about war, like so much about wars is told through us through oral storytelling. So my dad was the youngest of 9 brothers, and in World War II, a bunch of them went overseas. And then my dad got very jealous because he felt he was missing out. And he also thought, had heard this rumor that the women in Europe fell in love very easily. So he went and got a fake birth certificate, even though he was 14, and he went overseas. And so I would always ask my dad for tales about World War II from him, and I would ask my uncles. And every time they would tell me the tales, they would never talk about the actual fighting. They would just tell me fairy tales. And it was this strange place, because it was the only time my dad had ever, left Montreal and gone to Europe. He never went again. So they were always fanciful, and there was tales of like he met this girl who was living in a tree, or he had this tale in France that there was this goose, and the goose had followed him all over France because it had fallen in love with him, and it was very embarrassing for the other soldiers to see that he had a goose just following him around. And so they were all kind of just these really magical tales. So I was like, I want to tell a tale of war, but based on the sort of fantastical, like, bedtime stories I was told about the war. So I had that idea, and then I went, so then I wanted to make my own sort of country for it to be so it could be an allegory sort of for all the different genocidal movements. And so the first place I went was I went over to Germany. I went to Berlin. I did a residency there, and I was just researching things. And then, as one does when one is, I met some people, and they were telling me about this puppeteer who lived in Poland. And then I became really fascinated by this puppeteer because I wanted him to make me a marionette. And they were like, there's no point, he's drunk and he's gone mad. You'll go there and he's going to be drinking. But I looked at his work and I was like, I have to have a marionette of Heather. And then I was like, I can just, like now, I could have had the marionette of Heather. I could be behind here. It could just do everything for me, and it would just be so much more fantastic. Anyway, so I took a train and then some cars, and I went all the way through the Black Forest. And then as I was going through the Black Forest, like I felt that history of, first of all, I was like, I understand the Grimm's fairy tales. Like the way you see the trees, and they're so wicked and inviting, and they're like, come into here, and you're like, no. Anyway, so I met the puppeteer, and he was drunk, as they said. But he did have, the trip was not worthless because he had a donkey. And he was like, would you like to see a donkey who dances? And I was like, absolutely, sir. Anyways, so then I decided, so while I was in Poland during this time too, the Ukraine had been invaded. So I was very interested in borders. So I was like, I'm going to create my little country right here. And then the other place I was researching a lot of the Ukraine, and the other place that I was really interested in was the Palestinian-Israel conflict because of this idea of indigeneity. And in my book, it becomes this conflict of who the land belongs to. So off I went to Palestine. And that was just really interesting because while I was there, because Alicia, this country I created, is one that really has decided to create its identity, because it's a new little country that got its borders after World War I, and they decide to invest just heavily in the arts. And they're like, we'll have books and plays and theater and the opera, and if anything ever were to happen to us, surely the West would not allow it because we're artists. And so they don't bother with an army, which of course ends up being disastrous. And they become occupied. And when I was in Palestine, then I was really interested in the idea of how an artist creates under occupation. So I just was traveling around, and I went to children's theater. This is in the West Bank. I went to see a woman who writes children's books, and she goes and reads them to incarcerated children. And I went to this one, just everything, and just talking to artists there who really believed that the power of their writing would change the narrative and save Palestine. And then I went to this one museum where an artist had, and it was next to a town that had been razed to the ground. And this artist had collected, a group of artists, all the little pieces, tiles that they could find that had washed up onto the beach, or that they had found like in the sand or anywhere, and they had put it all together on the floor. And from those little pieces, and you could look at the tiles, and it was like the artwork on them was exquisite, and you were like, oh, this is like not Western, it's the Ottoman Empire. Clearly there was a city here. And then I just felt the city kind of raise up, and I was like, yes, there was actually a vibrant city here. So in my book, the plot, Sophia's mother is a great writer, and she wants Sophia to get this manuscript out of the country because the enemy is coming in and they are destroying all of culture. Because that is, for me, a genocidal movement. If it's a war, they come for the able-bodied men. But when it's a genocide, they come for the artists and the children. And that's how it begins. So Sophia's mother is like, if you can get this one manuscript out, people will see that Alicia was a country that was full of intellectuals, and we had a personality and a character.
I thought it was perhaps the high and holy days of the Canada Council back in the old days when they were really supporting the arts, and it was quite something, 20, 30 years ago when we were beginning to develop as a country with a voice and a vision and with music and
without it you don't exist. And that's like in Quebec, the Quiet Revolution.
Oh,
it became,
yes, of course.
We will have intellectuals and all these working class. It was like one generation to go from working class, and they had CEGEPs were free universities, and it was just like, go, get educated. And it had such an, I wasn't alive, but I've heard tales. Sounds exciting.
No, it was quite a time. And also, I found that Sophia's relationship with her mother was it was filled with tension. And I really responded to that because, of course, in my book, I also have a mother-daughter relationship that is filled with confusion and tension. And the mother is not an artist. The mother is a teacher, but she is confused and has power imbalance problems to the extent that she pretty much projects almost all of what she wants to do onto a man in her surroundings, and therefore comes to grief as a result of that. But it's fascinating. The country under occupation is often a place of high artistic output. That's absolutely true of Ireland, for example, where they used to speak Irish Gaelic in Ireland, but then the occupiers' language took over, as did the occupiers' rules, and then the Irish used the occupiers' language to be better, actually, in the early 20th century, better writers than the occupiers. So that was really quite something.
Yeah, the relationship with the Irish have to writing. Like when I was in Ireland, I was so, first, after I went to Ireland, I just believed in fairies. Saw them, met them, they're there, they live in Ireland.
Well, it's true.
But, so, I was reading that the Gaelic language, there they call it Irish, had been given to the people by the fairy, so that actually when you speak Gaelic, it's actually magical incantations, and this idea that Gaelic is underneath English when they speak it. And so this idea, idea of Irish being, like, I wanted Alicia to have that too, like they think their language is magical.
Mm-hmm. And the Irish language, I was lucky enough to, almost by mistake, buy a house, a tiny little cottage, in the middle of the Gaeltacht, which means that everybody's primary language was Irish Gaelic. And it was absolutely true that underneath that language, when the old people didn't speak English, but the younger people, of course, did. And when they spoke English, it was almost impossible to understand them because they added syllables to English words to make it have the same musical content as Irish. So they would say, "I'm going to the farm," and that would be the farm. And of course, it took me a little while for my hearing to actually, be able to transcribe. I mean, I was pretty much translating from my husband and daughter because I was the one who spent most time there. But I was translating English into English, which was really something.
Heather, with your book, and it's such a delight to hear you talk about fairies and magic and all the wonderful things, but there is a real undercurrent of darknesses there that you're exploring as well. Talk about that balance that you skirt so well in many of your books, but especially this one, where you're dancing along. There's a magical goose, and there's all of these wonderful things, but boy, can it get dark.
Yeah, it does get really dark, doesn't it? But it's in the land. Like when I first had the idea that Sophia would have a goose, and the goose actually is a talking goose. When she meets, she's like, "Oh my God, you speak, it's amazing." But I was so interested because I really like Samuel Beckett and a lot of absurdist plays that came after the war, and I had read them when I was younger, and it's something about the fragmentation of the logic once you've been through a trauma where nothing makes sense. So I wanted to create a language where, a child, and the goose, of course, also, he speaks like a philosophical child, like how there would be a language, a kind of play going on, and how they would express childhood trauma. Because when you're a child and terrible things are happening to you, you don't have the words or vocabulary for it. So the two of them are sort of like, philosophers who are dealing with a new problem, and how do they explain their situation? And it's that. And there's this loveliness to the way children deal with big problems, and when they use big words in strange ways, and they have the absurd tangents. So I wanted to kind of keep all that and have, but the lightness and the dark is just something, I find the dark, writing about darkness so beautiful also, and it makes the lightness lighter, and to compare the two, it's like a dance between them, and it allows the joy to be brighter. It just makes everything more alive when you kind of put the two of them together.
Oh, and Jane, you do touch on that a little bit, and we'll get to that theme about the idea of when you're living through difficult times, when there is pain. It's a very Buddhist thought as well, where that often brings the joy. But to your book, there are themes of colonial expansion, and you set this in rural Saskatchewan, and the displaced First Nations, which is sort of an undercurrent that you talk about throughout the book while you're exploring the relationship between Emer and her surroundings. So this is a woman. As a child, we meet her. When she spends time in the hospital, and that seems like such a lonely time and very her parents are not able to visit her. Can you just tell us how she got there, how the incident and where that incident was born in your mind?
When I was a child, and in fact, even when I was an adult, a story was told to me about the one arm of my mother's family, the Irish side of the family, that went to Saskatchewan in the 1920s, as so many agricultural families did, because only one son could inherit the farm, and that meant that, other sons had to look for other land in other places, and Saskatchewan and the prairies were being given away at this point, like literally, which is pretty interesting to me, because of course the people giving Saskatchewan away, that would be again the
Does somebody need to get that?
colonizers.
You need to get that? Okay.
That didn't own it in the first place. I mean, really, it was. It's a very disturbing notion, but nevertheless, people came from all over the world to settle in Saskatchewan. So there were these various tribal units settling in Saskatchewan, and among them were members of my own family. This would probably be my great uncle's generation. I assume that the child to whom this happened would have been my great uncle, and perhaps in the hands of my great uncle. They went to Saskatchewan, they built their barn, they built their house, and then an enormous tornado came and completely destroyed everything that they had worked so hard to build. In the course of that tornado, a young boy, in fact, was picked up by the wind and then thrown 4 fields over, and every bone in his body was broken. My great uncle put him on the front door of the house, and with an older brother, they walked through the woods to a train track. The expansion that you're referring to. The railroad was absolutely responsible for expansion, and flagged down a train and handed the child up to the train employees who, and said, "This child needs to go to a hospital." And the train employees took the child to a hospital. And that was always in my imagination. I knew eventually that I was going to write about it, because it's such a thrilling notion. And then the child spent a year in the hospital, didn't see his parents for a year, and was looked after by the medical staff of the hospital. And this was long before any kind of universal Medicare in this country, and I'm pretty positive that my great uncle could not have afforded a year in a hospital for a child, but nevertheless, this took place. I began to write the book from the point of view of a little boy, or a man looking back on his childhood, and then somehow the voice was just not working, so I had to begin it all over again. I was about 2/3 of the way through the first draft, and that child underwent a gender change and turned into a girl, and hence Emer. And it was a fascination with the history of medicine in the country, and also the history of education and what education meant, and also the colonization process as doled out by the educational system of the time. So, for example, even when I was being taught how to read, we were reading about drowned children who were English, and They were either lashed to the mast of their father's ship and then, found bobbing near the shore and they're still lashed to the mast, or they were on the burning deck, or they were like Mary, walking along the sands of Dee and taking the cattle home until finally a rogue wave got her and the cattle, and everybody was drowned. And so I thought about what that would be like if you lived on the prairies. Like, in other words, because of course the standardization of education meant that everybody was reading the same thing, but none of it was taking place where people lived. And that, to me, as a matter of fact, I once had tea with David Malouf and Vikram Seth and Rohinton Mystery and I all had tea together, and we, in some literary festival, I think it was in Australia, but whatever the case, we realized we'd all had precisely the same education, and that they also had experienced the drowned English children. So by the time we got to meet English children, we expected that they would be drowned sooner or later, and that was just the way it was. And none of the landscapes that we were reading about were landscapes that we recognized or that we saw out our schoolroom windows, and that included people in India, people in Sri Lanka, people in Australia, New Zealand, et cetera, and people in Canada.
And Jane, this childhood ward that we spend a lot of time in the book, it becomes Emer's second family. I mean, these children really rely on each other. We come to love them. They have these magical moments where there's art, there is a circus, there is the real support of one another. They really rely on one another.
Yes, and of course, I was doing all sorts of things self-indulgently with that hospital ward. So, for example, Dr. Angel is based on William Carlos Williams, who is a famous American poet whom I have adored since I was 15 years old, and I knew that William Carlos Williams was also a doctor. So I just thought, why not? And then I get to quote William Carlos Williams in the book, which is wonderful, but attribute it to Dr. Angel rather than himself. However, he is in the acknowledgments. And so it was fun to be in the children's ward. And also, I found that the research that I was doing was pretty very stimulating and very kind of enlightening in that sense, and in the real sense of lightening. So, for example, I was reading, my mother was a registered nurse, and I was reading her textbooks from the 30s in order to get some kind of a feel for what the nuts and bolts of running a hospital would be like. In that period, although, my mother was obviously 15 years later, but nevertheless, I knew this was pre-antibiotics, so the whole world would have sparkled. The interiors of hospital rooms were so clean because sterilization was the only way to keep infection down. And so everything was just polished up. My mother always told me that 3/4 of nursing in those days, of course the women would have to do it, right, was scrubbing stuff, in other words, keeping everything clean. So to me, in my visual imagination, the whole ward was, sort of glass and steel and polished terrazzo floors, and there was a kind of lightness to it, in a way, even though what was happening to the children themselves was pretty tragic.
And Heather, you have a pretty pivotal scene in a hospital as well in the book, but it's sort of a bit of a house of horrors, as a child would see it. Can you describe where that came for you, where you imagined all these awful things that may happen in a hospital?
Yeah, I think it's hard to say, because you write the book and then later you pretend you know why you did it. But so I think first of all, I was looking for a building because there's a girl in the building, and I like the idea of them going in there and living with her for a time, but not knowing where she is and just feeling that she was a ghost. And yeah, I mean, as far as the horrors of medicine, and also, like, my daughter is writing a graphic novel and she's almost done, but she's writing at the same time as I did because she had to, when she was really young, her father died of an overdose, and so immediately there was this frenzy she felt, how she remembers it, over his body. And so her novel's about how organs always go up and how actually the fentanyl crisis in Canada has ended the organ donation. Like, there is now we have too many organs because so many young people are dying of fentanyl overdoses and their bodies come perfect. And it's like, so they took, his eyes, his heart, just literally everything. So now so my daughter is like writing this novel about the horrors of medicine and like all, how when a poor person goes into the hospital, it's quite different than when a rich person goes into the hospital and who is ignored by the medical and so maybe it was that, but it was also, and she needed her supplies of drugs because they meet this little girl who is, she's a bit old. She's like 16, and she's lovely. Like, I had a lot of fun. Sometimes you just fall in love with a character, and I just loved Celeste, and she's always high, and she's always falling asleep, and she's just one of these little young girls that everybody falls in love with, but is hopelessly tragic because they've just gotten addicted to people falling in love with them, and they're sort of stuck in this fanciful land of prettiness.
And we see what happens with that dynamic in the hospital. It's very vivid and very, very memorable. Jade, I want to talk a little bit more about Emer, and I will pause us for a break shortly, but a couple more questions, and then we'll come back and we'll ask more questions. Emer, as a result of her childhood injury that kept her in the hospital for a year, she walks with a limp as an adult. She is unmarried, but she has this lover. She has taken up with a man named Harp. And this is a man who I find it a fascinating biographical detail because he is known out in the world for a huge breakthrough medical discovery. But we don't get to know him that much because they live separate lives. And so why is that?
Well, as I say, I was obsessed by the history of things medical and also, education at this point. And I needed her to have a romantic liaison that kind of mirrored her mother's, but would be softer. Her mother's romantic liaison is really harsh. And I wanted her to have a difficult romantic liaison with a powerful man in the same way that her mother had a difficult romantic liaison with a powerful man, though not, he was pretty well known as well, but not for things that would help humanity. He was known as a politician. He was known as a minister of education and as a controller of education and as a kind of leveler of education, as trying to make everybody English. But Emer's love affair was with a man who had actually done something really, really, really positive for the world, so that medical discovery really changed people's lives for the better, and also prolonged people's lives. And yet he was a flawed character. And that fascinated me. And I didn't want him to be, some kind of knight in shining armor. I wanted him to be flawed, and I wanted to show that dynamic between the human and the public, in a way. In other words, the fact that somebody can make a discovery or create something very, very beautiful does not mean that they themselves are, a perfect person. And of course, Harp was named after the Hellenistic god Harpocrates. And Harpocrates was not only the god of silence and secrecy, but also the god of hope. And so I thought, what a perfect name for this man, So she nicknames him Harp after Harpocrates, and then I didn't have to name him, and so you guys can figure it out,
Right. But as you touched on, Emer's relationship with Harp and her mother's relationship with her love interest, I guess you could say, who was not Emer's father. Both of these women seem to get meaning for their own lives in proximity to men, to the men in their lives who were doing grand things.
And they, of course, were powerless.
Yeah.
And it's only been 6 seconds, or not even that, milliseconds in the history of the world that women have had any power at all. And we're still struggling. We're still having problems with this. And every time you kind of inch forward, there's always a backwards movement to the progress. And so I was interested in what happens to a really intelligent woman when she has no opportunities whatsoever beyond really being a school teacher. That's about all that you could hope for in the rural world that my mother grew up in, and definitely that Emer was growing up in. Yeah. Yes.
And Heather, when it comes to your mother-daughter relationship, Clara Bottom was this well-known, well-respected feminist in Alicia, and this was her, her manuscript that needed to get out of the country in order to save the country through Sophia, and it didn't quite work out that way. But the idea of creating an iconic feminist, and I've suspect that the goose has some tendencies of Simone de Beauvoir as well when you talk about a great feminist. What was that like to have that inspiration, I guess, to write about?
Actually, first I'll say, like the goose, when I was creating him, that I wanted him to be a combination of Samuel Beckett and Simone de Beauvoir. And then when I was doing my research, I found that in their later years, they both lived at the opposite ends of the same street and hated each other's guts. So I was like, oh, perfect. So I needed to create a mother, because my editor was like, when I handed in, I remember The Lonely Hearts Hotel, she was like, oh, another novel without mothers. And I was like, oh my God, I forgot mothers again. And so this one, I was like, I can't just keep repeating myself. I need a mother. And so because my mother had abandoned me when I was 7, so it's sort of my central sense of self as being a motherless child. So I was just creating all these motherless children. So I was like, Sophia will have a mother. So, yeah, I created Simone de Beauvoir as her mother. Because I was like, maybe what would it be like if Simone de Beauvoir had a child? Because Simone de Beauvoir used to go around, and one of her central ideas was that you could not be a mother and an existentialist. And for me, you know, I sort of had this conflicting idea about being a mother myself. I became a mother quite young, and then very shortly after, I will say 5 or 6 days, I said, I have made a terrible mistake. The feminists were right. Having a child is absolutely incompatible with intellectual life. So then I was like, I've decided not to have children, even though I already had one. I know it's complicated, but it was. So I wanted someone who had this sort of dichotomy. Yeah, it was like when J.D. Vance insults childless cat ladies. I'm like, how dare you come at me that way? And I'm like, oh, wait a second. I'm not a childless cat lady. I am a mother, actually. So I wanted that kind of this mother who doesn't believe in having children. And then it was, because my daughter read the book and she was like, oh my God, I have so much to ask you about Clara Bottom.
Exactly. I was thinking of your daughter as I read them.
I was like, no, she's based on Simone de Beauvoir. She's like, who are you kidding? Clara Bottom is your evil avatar. It's who you want to be. I don't know.
I love
But
that.
yeah, they have an interesting relationship.
So Samuel Beckett was sort of had the goose had tendencies of Samuel Beckett with a sprinkle of Simone de Beauvoir, but Clara was mainly Simone de Beauvoir.
Yeah, or
Yeah,
me.
gotcha. Yeah, or you. Or
I
you.
think I am.
But we're not admitting that.
Yeah, because she also, like, what I thought was, because the book is it talks so much about the power of writing and the, idealism of writing. And I think writing is just central to existence. But I also wanted to deal a little bit with how artists are at home and how, because it's the most, it's this noble art form, but artists are like insane and they're jealous of each other and they're petty and they're crazy. And at one point it's the war, and then there's a university that has been closed, and then Clara Bottom is complaining about it. And Sophia says, but I don't understand. You always said this was a second-rate university. And she's like, Sophia, insulting all of one's friends is the luxury of peacetime.
Yeah, that's a great line. I once wrote a novel that I thought was about Simone de Beauvoir. In fact, it was my last novel 10 years ago, but didn't turn out to be about Simone de Beauvoir in the same way, I guess, and sort of that she changed character. But my notion was when Simone de Beauvoir left Nelson Algren, she had gone to spend the summer with her lover, Nelson Algren, in the States, and he went off Simone de Beauvoir early on, and she had the whole rest of the summer to spend there. But she finally bought a plane ticket, and this was in the days when the planes had to refuel in Gander Airport. And so I thought, oh my God, I have to write a novel about Simone de Beauvoir being fogged in Gander Airport after leaving Nelson Algren. And it was just, I began the novel with that idea in mind. And then she turned into a different character altogether. So we have that in common. We have Simone in common.
It's interesting because how you were talking about, you wrote the novel 2/3 the way through and then threw it out. Like, I don't think people realize how much waste goes into novel writing.
Yes,
like
it's
you
true.
will I will write entire drafts of books. I'm like, this is done, and I just throw it out because it's like, no.
You'll
doesn't
throw
work.
it out.
Yes.
Well, you have to.
You have to. Often novels go in the garbage.
Either that or it goes into your archive, and then you're shamed and blamed forever. So, that's what you do, yeah.
Okay, I want to definitely explore more of that after the break. So many more questions. But before we take a little break, one more question for you, Jane, just on history, because I found this a fascinating part of the book that, without giving out any spoilers, we do meet white supremacy on the prairies in the form of the Ku Klux Klan. And I think this surprised me a little bit, that it was such a vibrant chapter of the Ku Klux Klan in Saskatchewan. Researching that, how did you stumble on that fact? I mean, maybe your history is a little better than mine, but it shocked me that it was doing so well there.
Yes, it did well for a while there. And it was an interesting kind of variant of the Klan for two reasons. One of which was that they really weren't after Black people in Saskatchewan, even though there was a very small Black settlement in Saskatchewan at the time. I'm not sure that the Klan had it together enough to even realize that they were there. So they were after Jews and people from Eastern European countries who practiced different forms of Christianity, and they were after Roman Catholics and that sort of thing, and also people who did not speak English. That was already too much of a difference for the Klan. But what really surprised me was the women's branch. I didn't know about that until I had heard about the Klan, making an appearance in Saskatchewan, but when I began to research how they made an appearance, the women's branch was in fact very active. Of course, they had to ask the men's branch they had to gain permission from the creepy men's branch. They were pretty creepy themselves, the women's branch. But I don't know why I felt that women would be exempt from this kind of thing, but I did. I was surprised by it. And when I saw a diagram of the clothing that the women wore, which was very similar to the clothing that the guys wear, they get dressed up in these clown suits, really, basically, with the wizard hat and the eyes coming through. Down at the bottom of the drawing, and this was an official diagram to be given out to the women's group, was a little pair of very strappy shoes. Very 1920s, and I thought, wow, that gave it a reality in a way that nothing else could have. Just that one detail, I thought, oh God, it really did exist. There really was a women's branch.
Wow. Yeah, not to be naive about it, but it did shock me that it did so well in Canada, the Ku Klux Klan, and that we really didn't know much about it. I don't know if you did, but it came as a complete surprise to me. So why don't, on that chipper note, why don't we take a little break? So it's 8:10 now. Why don't we meet back at 8:20? We'll do a few more questions, and then we'll take your questions for Jane and Heather. So go on out, get some refreshments, and we'll see you back in about 10 minutes. Thanks, everyone. We'll just do a few more questions, I think. There are a million questions, and then we'll get to you. Did you have a good break? Lots of good stuff out there? Yeah. Okay. Alrighty. So, backstage we were just chatting a bit more about this idea of writing 3/4 of a book and then tossing it out. So, Jane, just expand on that a little bit. Like, when you've written this much, and what makes you decide then that it's got to go, it's not staying?
Well, the feeling that it's not moving forward in a natural, sort of fluid way, I usually try to ignore that feeling, but it makes itself known to me over and over again, and finally I can't ignore it any longer because I can't make it go away. And at that point I know that something's not working, and I have to get conscious because mostly creating the first and especially the first draft, is an unconscious activity. And I have to get conscious and try to distance myself from the works in order to read it. And then I often will find what the problem is. And if the problem is systemic, in other words, it's like a gender problem. And that has happened once before, actually, in the opposite direction with a book called The Underpainter, where I began it from the point of view of a woman and ultimately realized that the male character was deeply inside my head and needed to be the voice of the book. And he wasn't a very nice guy either. But whatever, I threw that first draft out as well for the same reason. It's just odd now that I think of it. Perhaps I should be talking to somebody about this. Anyway. So we put, I mean, there are many, many, many drafts of a novel. I know it's a long writing process, but it needs to go through enormous numbers of drafts. And I was kind of explain it as a journey towards consciousness. Like I begin with a first draft that is really, well, it's like being a child again and just making stuff up. But then, you know, by the next draft, I'm a little more conscious of what I'm doing. And by the 11th draft, I'm not fully conscious because I never ever really have achieved high consciousness. But I'm more conscious than I was in the beginning. I mean, it really is an act where you have to stop the rational part of your brain in order to get the first draft down, I feel. And then, you know, so I often do the research later. So that, because, you know, I want to make sure that what I have gathered or what I've gleaned is accurate in some way or another. But so the first draft happens without the research.
Okay, and then you narrow in on some of the specifics. Heather, you're nodding away there. How much stuff do you throw out?
I was just nodding because the research thing, because I often, I'll do the same thing with historical fiction. It's usually a time that I've been thinking about for years and years, and then it's like when you're interested in a period, then it's like all the little things about it that I like, and then I create it, and then I have to research to make sure everything's right and to add certain details. I actually just went to see this play in New York called Oh Mary, and the comedian, it's about Abraham Lincoln's wife, and then the guy who wrote it, he was like, I didn't do any research at all because I didn't want to know anything the audience didn't. Anyways, I went to see it. It's completely insane. I'm like, that's not right at all. But it's very funny. And he's like Mary Todd is like a gay cabaret star in her past. What was I saying? So yeah, exactly like Jane was saying, there's something about the first draft which is like, so I have the idea, but I'm just after the beauty. And it's just I'm writing, like, and I write all the scenes that excite me and just things that I find like incandescent. Like there's a scene where, in the book where Celeste is talking and then she just falls asleep and her head falls into spaghetti. I remember writing that and I was like, that's beautiful. That's perfect. And things like that. And then, but now but there is some sort of elemental strange thing because now I'm writing a book about witches. And every time I write about one of the acts of magic or witchcraft, strange things start to happen. So I'm like, okay, it's working because obviously this is real magic.
But I think that happens, doesn't it?
Yes,
I mean,
totally.
The world seems to cooperate when you're writing a novel.
Totally.
So that you come across stuff that you never would come across
No.
if you weren't writing
Yes.
that novel.
That's that, but not the witch one. The witch one, I was writing a scene. Then I went in the kitchen. The kitchen was covered with mice. And I'd never seen a mouse before. So I immediately called the landlord. The landlord comes the next day with the inspector. And I was with the exterminator. And I'm like, I walked into the kitchen. I've never seen anything like it. There were mice everywhere. And the exterminator turns to the landlady and he's like, is it possible she saw one mouse? And she's like, yes, probably. And then the landlady said it might have been because of the floods we had last week that the mice have gone up from the basement to the third floor. And I was like, no. I've been writing about witches. And witches need familiars. And then the mice came to my kitchen.
You got a few familiars then.
And then the landlady was like, please don't listen to her. She's a writer.
But it is true that the world just seems to cooperate.
Totally,
I mean,
yes.
I find that, so for example, when I was writing my third novel, which was Away, I found that every second person I ran into was Irish. And I had not run into any, I had run into Irish descendants, of course. You're one of them. And, but I had not run into any actual Irish people with Irish accents. And then suddenly there were flocks of them, and sort of like your mice. Yeah, so I think that whatever we need arrives on our doorstep in some way.
It's like even when I was researching Israel-Palestine, then a Palestinian called me up and she's like, would you like to come to Palestine? I was like, yes, obviously. I need to go to Palestine.
Yes,
You know?
exactly.
It's just these strange things. It's like the universe knows, because there's something, I'm gonna get totally flaky, there's something godlike about the act of writing, and
Well,
the
it's
universe is like,
creation.
exactly, and the universe changes towards it.
So there you go.
Okay, so
And the mere mortals in the room.
yeah. We'll just go with that. We're just going to go with that. I think so. But then when you have to throw things out, going back to the original part of this, and because I'm sorry to be so fixated on this, but I just can't imagine all this work that you put into this that you're then tossing. So how do you know what you might toss or what you might keep, and when you have to start all over again or just tweak it? Like how does that work?
Well, first of all, you have the mindset. Like, in other words, you take away imagery from the first draft, even if you throw the first draft out. You know what was in that draft, and you're probably somewhere in the right territory at least, but you have to do something often radical, like change the gender of the narrator, and as a result of that, you have to trash the first draft, and that's fine. I mean, there's no real recipe for any of this, so I can't really tell you how I know what to keep and what to throw away. But I know it sounds goofy and and as if you're sort of goofing off, but it really is a feeling. It's just an instinct. It's intuitive, and sometimes you're not right. That's the other thing. Often you're not right. So the second draft has to go. And then the third, and then the fourth, So I've taken to perhaps saving one or two drafts, but often they end up in the shredder because they just are part of the process. It's just part of the process.
Yeah. But for me, now what I've started doing is I will write 2 books at the same time. So... But no, because then I do a draft and I put it aside, because I found I was doing drafts and then I was reading them and I was like, this is terrible. And I would throw it out. Or then I'd start editing and then I would just keep deleting things until there was nothing left. And I was like, what happened to my novel? So now I write it, and then I don't touch it, and then I work on the other thing. And then I get sick of this one, I'm like, it's terrible. And then I go back to that one, I'm like, hey, that was not so bad. And you just see it with new eyes. Like, to see it with new eyes. So I always need that kind of 3 months that I take off from a draft, because then you go back and you can read it and see what's there. Because the first draft is so complicated because you have what's in your head, and you're like writing it all, and then you don't know what actually looks like what you want it to look like in your head.
Yeah, and I do approximately the same thing, but I don't work on anything for 3 months. I mean, I just kind of goof off for 3 months, and then but it is true that if you put some time between you and the work, it looks a lot better than it does often when you're right on top of it. And so I have done that. And in fact, that's why it took me 10 years to write this book, because real life intervened, and I had to live it. So I didn't get anywhere near this novel for a couple of years, in fact, after a couple of drafts, and then went back to it and started to tinker with it and play with it, and eventually I got serious about it and began to really seriously work on it.
Okay. So, you've both been at this for a number of decades. How have you changed as a writer in terms of what interests you, in terms of how you approach the craft, how you have evolved?
I would say not at all.
No?
No, I don't think I have changed. I don't really think that, I mean, I've changed as a person, and I suppose you can't, it's hard to know. But when I go back and read my first novel, I'm usually I'm kind of embarrassingly impressed by it, I have to say.
That's so good.
And so if I have changed, I may have gotten worse. So I don't want to admit to change.
So good. I love it. That's great. Heather, how about you?
I think, I don't know. It's hard to say. I think I've definitely gotten better with structures of plots and just being able to do complicated plots, and that's kind of something that you grow into. I would say the biggest difference is just the life change. Like, when I wrote my first novel, it was like, I had like half an hour in the evening because I was like a single mom and I had like a shitty waitress job, and it was just like, and it was like hell and poverty and just like, but now it's just like, I'm a king. It's like I write at Versailles, I don't even get out of bed to write. Just like, where's my notebook and pen? Write it to me, all that is.
Sounds like the mother in your novel.
Simone over here. That's good. Okay, what questions do you have for our authors? Just pop your hand up, and we'll have you belt it out. Oh, now they've gone all shy. Come on, right there in the back. Why don't we start with you?
When I got pregnant the first time, and then took a series of jobs, I think, that felt like it was the right thing to do, and I was kind of mourning my artist self ever since, and I'm just so in awe of your story, because the story of your mother, the Simone de Beauvoir inside of you, but then your daughter is amazing, and you're obviously so close. So I didn't ask it in Montreal, and then after I was like, I should have asked it, and my daughter said, yeah, you should have. So I'm asking you now.
So what's the question?
So the question is, the question is, thank you. The question is, what is your advice for artists, mothers, to just take the chance on your creative process, and to also maintain your ability to just also inspire closeness, because Simone also lost out on a chance to be a mother and an artist, which are two amazing things that you could be.
I'm still against having children. But yeah, it's like my daughter too, because then people are like, how do you do? Because she does like everything, right? She's just like really talented and can build, like, just builds things and makes things. And then people are like, how can you do so much stuff? She's like, you don't understand what my mother was like as a child. She was just so hard to impress. But I think, like, yeah, I just, luckily she was actually very, like, creative too. And then I think when we finally, like, I found everything about motherhood just incredibly boring and a waste of my time. But then she started, like, she was actually really creative. So we started having projects together, where we would just, like, build things and, like, and sew and then I would just take her to lectures and stuff. And then I developed this, we had this thing where I would say, okay, one thing for you, one thing for me. So I remember, like, we were in New York, and then her one thing was she wanted to play in the parks, went to Washington Square Park and sat there for a while. And then afterwards I was like, we're going to see Samuel Beckett. And then, like, but in the play, it was so cute because she was like, I think she was 7, and at one point she's just like nudging me. She's like, one question. I'm like, what? Why are the grandparents in the garbage cans? I'm like, it's a metaphor. And she's like, okay, thank you. But anyway, so, I mean, and now, that became the sort of pattern of our relationship. Like, we just started creating together and drawing together, and now, like, I live in a building and she lives across the street in another building, and we always, like, meet at 3 o'clock and, like, and you know, the neighbors are used to us. Like, I made we made this giant dress out of my draft of the book, just wandering down the street. Like, we just do projects at 3 o'clock.
So I had, when I married my husband, he was living alone with his 4 children. And I was 25. And he was 40. And these kids had been living alone with their father for 2 years, and he had been creating all kinds of wonderful projects and making stuff in the studio and not really paying much attention. He loved those children, but they were wild. And and I was closer in age to the 2 girls than I was to him. And so we had, you know, like, sort of role issues around the family, but we all had fun together, and I know that if I had been 40 years old, I wouldn't have been able to do it, but I wasn't, so I was still a kid myself, and we had a lot of fun, and then I had a baby. Now, I was going to preface this with saying that I was against having children too. But then I had a baby, and of course those girls knew more about babies than I did, but it was nevertheless wild. And by this time they had boyfriends, and, you know, the place was just a zoo, and we had a really bad dog that was always out biting people, and it was crazy. And so the wonderful thing was that school happened. And not only did Tony go to school, you know, to teach fine arts at Waterloo, but all of the kids went to school except for the baby, who to this day claims that I would force her to have 5-hour naps. And that's when I got some time for myself. And my imagination just wanted, you know, out of that situation, even though it was a pretty happy situation. I wanted an alternative, and so I started creating these worlds and doing it at the kitchen table, while feeding a lot of laundry to the washing machine and stuff like that. But I was always grateful that that happened, because otherwise I would have had to get a real job. And this way, I was able to at least have a roof over my head and times that I could count on when all the craziness would go away. Whereas if I'd had a real job, I don't think I would have been able to write the novels. That's the bottom line.
Yeah, great. Thank
Although
you.
I did work as a waitress
Yeah,
with
that's
Miss
terrible
Nude
jobs.
Canada and her all-male nude band.
Wait,
I was a waitress, not
Miss Nude Canada.
or the all-male
Okay.
nude band. No.
Did
But
you want to add
it's
something?
very different like stepchildren. Did you find it's very different? Like I find people lie about the whole stepchildren thing. Like you're supposed to.
I'm supposed to be the wicked stepmother, and I still sign all of their birthday cards, things with love from your wicked stepmother.
Yeah.
But, you know, I couldn't really be a stepmother because I wasn't old enough to have had them. And so,
Yeah.
like, I would have been 9 or something when they were born, and that was not possible. So I think the fact that I couldn't really have been their mother made it much easier for us. Yeah, we all got along somehow.
Heather's still skeptical.
I don't know.
think.
My partner has children. And my partner got really upset because I referred to them as the Menendez brothers. But then the show came out and he watched it and he was like, "Oh, I do see the similarities."
God. Okay, other questions. What other questions do we have out there? Okay, right here in the front, Ellen. Yeah, you want to try and belt it out?
Yeah, I used to be an actor, so that's fine.
Okay.
It's just a comment. I think the theme was joy. Right?
Yeah.
I honestly haven't heard that much about writing about joy, but you guys are hilarious. Like, I haven't had this much joy in a good long time, so I just want to thank you for that. That's it.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. That was completely planned. We just wanted to create joy instead of talk about joy. Right here in the front, I think, Helen. Yeah.
Thanks. Well, I agree with the joy. I want to ask if you ever thought about writing nonfiction and using your storytelling brilliance to get across messages in a nonfiction format. I lived my life writing nonfiction and being accused of writing fiction. And I think the reverse would be so nice because storytelling to get the message across is important, especially these days. And have you tinkered with that or thought about it?
Do you mean like memoir or just journalism?
Whatever crosses your mind that you're concerned about, what issues you're concerned about, what
Yeah, I
bothers
do.
you?
I do write a lot of essays, and I love the essay. And there's something about it, and even that it's nonfiction, and then it's like I just take a bunch of things and have some ridiculously half-baked polemic idea about it, and it's like just so much fun. It's fun to play with that and to think about the world in an original way. And then when you kind of having spent so much time writing poetry and fiction, like when you look at the world, you start to see different connections and have ideas about it, and it's almost impossible to just digest what other people have told you. So yeah, I love writing nonfiction.
I do not.
Because you've written nonfiction.
I have written nonfiction. I wrote a biography for that little Penguin series of Lucy Maud Montgomery, and I also wrote something that was, encouraged by HarperCollins, called A Number of Things for the 150th anniversary of Canada, but I find that I enjoy it when I look back on it, but the process is hard for me because I know that there's somebody. In both cases, these were commissions, and so I know there's somebody out there expecting something from me. There's another problem, and that is that my daughter writes nonfiction, and she is such a good writer. And so far, we haven't really crossed paths, you know. Who knows what she's working on now, because she's being very secretive and mysterious about it, and I suspect it might be fiction. But she is a tremendously gifted writer, and I just know that anything that I would write that would be nonfiction would be, would pale compared to hers. But there's also something else, and that is poetry. And I find that I'm really interested in what language feels like and sounds like, and I think that's probably because I was a poet for a long period of time, and I very much admire poets and poetry. And I always remember what Yeats said, and in a way it has to do with, to my mind anyway, fiction and nonfiction. He said that when he's having an argument with others, he creates rhetoric. And when he's having an argument with himself, he creates poetry. And I think that's interesting. I mean, the point being that I don't really want to expose, I don't feel that I'm in any way qualified to expose the wrongs of the world. Like, I don't really want to teach anybody anything with what I write. I just want to make art. In a way, I want to make visual art, really. I suppose I've been surrounded by visual artists all my life, and that might have something to do with it. But, and I deeply appreciate the nonfiction writers around me and read them and all of that, but it isn't where I'm coming from.
What's interesting, though, about nonfiction is, like, with fiction, you own the entire world. You've created everything. Whereas nonfiction, you're dealing with the facts, and you can't stray from them. And sometimes you're wrong, or you're missing a fact. Like, we were talking earlier about Alice Munro, and right after she died, I wrote an essay about her attitude towards motherhood and the idea of always in her stories putting the mother first. But I was not privy to the knowledge of what kind of mother she was. And then as soon as that came out, I was like, does my theory actually hold water? And then since the shock of that has been, like, I actually stopped, I had to take a couple months away from nonfiction because that sort of element of surprise in nonfiction where you can be wrong.
Or wrong, or more enlightened a number of years later. Yeah, or a year later, yes.
Well, I think it's very difficult to get all the facts on any subject, you know, like how...
But that's it, but that's the sort of joy of nonfiction. You take a leap. And that's, like, otherwise, you know, it's the same thing in conversation.
Take a position.
Yeah, you take a position. It's that thing, too, with, like, the idea of women who, you know, before they even speak about anything, feel like they need to have a PhD on the subject, and they never. So I was always like, no. You don't actually need to know anything, Heather, just write. Who's more smarter than you? No
That's
one.
right.
Let's go.
And you don't want to say anything about Mary Todd that the audience wouldn't already know.
Helen, we are at 9 o'clock. Do we have time for another question? Should we maybe take...
Okay, let's take 2 more questions.
2 more questions, and then that is it. Okay, I saw your hand here.
Your lives have given you the opportunity to step outside of this world, this country, and to see other countries, but also maybe to reflect on who you are. My question is, what makes you a Canadian writer? What is it about the way you write or who you are that makes you Canadian? And how do you see yourself as being Canadian, having been outside of this country?
Well, I have traveled in Ireland and Europe. I have not been to the Middle East ever. So I would say that anybody who is resident in Canada is a Canadian, has the potential to be a Canadian writer. I don't think there is any other definition, actually, at all. Or anybody who has ever been resident in Canada should be able to call themselves a Canadian writer. I think that, you know, I don't think that there's any real other definition of Canadians and writing. That being said, I think it's really important to read world literature and to get alternative points of view and also, you know, other times. You know, go through the history of literature. I mean, I'm as a reader, I don't feel very Canadian at all. I mean, I will read, obviously, I read Canadian books, but I don't feel compelled to read Canadian books. I read them because I like the authors, you know? And I don't mean personally, I mean, I like their work, and ditto for the rest of the world, so.
Heather, how about you?
What makes me a Canadian writer?
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I think it's, yeah, I mean, we were definitely, like, I would ask you, Jane, because I'm curious about, because you had Ellen Seligman as an editor, who was
Yes, I
also
did.
the editor of Michael Ondaatje and Atwood and Monroe. And how has, like, having that similar, the M&S, you know, fabled editor,
Right.
like, how has that kind of changed the voice of Canadian literature?
Well, you know, she was, well, in a way, I was one of the first that she kind of discovered me in the bulrushes. I had applied, or I sent my first manuscript in that I called The Thing to the Seal First Novel Prize, which was a prize that they used to have, and you could win $50,000. And I thought, so how many words do you have to have? And then I counted up all the words in The Thing, which was a long, long poetic meditation. And I sent it off, and Ellen was one of the readers of the Seal First Novel Award, but I predated the Atwood Ondaatje experience because they were already publishing at M&S, but not with her. And so they came to her a little bit later. But so Ellen and I kind of grew up together. She became the grand editor at M&S, and you know that happened. We were really good friends.
Yeah, because when I was reading this book, and I was like, there's something about Ellen, like the spirit of Ellen Seligman. Then I looked in your acknowledgments, and the last thing you're like, thank you, Ellen Seligman, who's dead now. But obviously, like you learn when you work with an editor, you learn what they teach you, and you continue to apply it. I don't know, because I went to school in Montreal, so I went to school in French, and then. I mean, it was sort of the opposite, where you were given all that English text. In French school, like everything we read was from Quebec, and it was amazing because then it gave you the feeling that Quebec was a place where literature came from, and it was like Michel Tremblay, which was like 2 streets over from where I lived, or Mary Claire Blais, and you could go see them at the library. So there was so much encouragement within Quebec. I mean, in Francophone world. They're like, Heather, stop writing in English. I'm like, it's really funny in English. But that, I did, that's one thing that I loved, that having all that literature, and then I've read a lot of Canadian literature, so it was a real sense that when I did start writing, I did have a sense that I was writing in this tradition.
Okay. That was a great question. Thank you for that. Okay, so who has a quick, easy question?
Hi. Sorry. I was just wondering, just in terms of the various iterations you described in the throwaway novels, how much influence, once you submit to your editors, how much influence they have in rewrites, or you know, do you actually have to go back and change whole chapters, or what happens there?
It's radical.
I would say yes, radical. But I have never had the experience of ever dropping a character or vastly changing a character or a storyline or narrative or anything like that. So the book is pretty settled by the time I submit. So
Do you give it to other readers first, though?
not so much,
Okay.
no. No, I used to read aloud to Tony when I was going through the first draft. And then he would say, and then what happens? And I'd go, well, I don't know. You know, like I haven't written it yet. But no, not so much, no. And so the book is settled with me in my mind by the time, but that being said, Ellen was one hell of an editor. And I mean, it was just like getting a really bad essay back that you submitted in grade 11. And there was just writing all over it and, you know, and hacking and going exclamation marks and, oh, really? That kind of thing. And so she was really tough, and she was brilliant. And I now have an inner Ellen.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. I feel the inner Ellen. For me, I actually, because I've had the same editor now for several books, I hand my drafts in like super messy that I wouldn't show to anybody else, but she just knows like what the mess is trying to forecast. So, but for me, the most, like having the editor is like they tell you, the most thing is like, tell me what you see. What's the book about? And then you have a conversation and she says like what she thinks the book is about and what's interesting about it, and then it's,
And then it'd be,
do you know what I mean? Then I'd say like, oh, that's what my book's about, huh?
okay.
Ellen used to say, but what does it mean, Jane? And then I would tell her what it meant, and she'd say, well, why don't you just say that then?
Awesome. Well, I think we will leave it there. We've had a pretty awesome night with these two, chatting about all kinds of things. Thank you, Heather and Jane.
And thank you, Lucy.
Terrific. And thank you all so much for coming again and supporting the Wakefield Writers Festival. Wakefield is just so awesome. This is truly one of my favorites to come and do every year. So thanks to Hélène for inviting me every year, and to you all for coming, and for these really comfortable chairs to have this conversation in. Have a great evening, everyone, and thanks again, Heather and Jane.
And to you, Lucy, for engaging in such a wonderful conversation with such warmth and insight and candor. Thank you very much for being with us. And yes. And there's still some more books here, and Heather and Jane will be signing at the table if you want to get your book signed. Thank you for coming.